Hey everybody, this is herculespetix, founder, curator, docent, and gift shop employee of the herculespetix Academy of Comic Book Studies. Today we're going to continue our look at the Cartoon History of the Universe by Larry Gonick. We're up to Volume 3, River Realms, Sumer and Egypt. We're basically covering 5000 to 1200 BC. This cover is very dull. When I started reading this again last night, I was like, God, you couldn't think of anything better for this cover? Not very good. But this is these were originally published in 1979, but these are the deluxe editions that were published sometime in the early to mid 80s. Cardstock covers and everything. They're pretty nice. So once again, we have the introduction by Larry Gonick. He throws away his monkey costume from last time because now it's true history, not just anthropology. People are humans, or humans are people, or whatever. So now we're starting with the first civilizations, river realms. So basically, 7,000 years ago, a bunch of civilizations had arose in the Asian hills in Egypt, but the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was pretty unpopulated because it was shitty land. It was just all mud. There was no rocks to build anything. And it had dust storms and floods. And when that wasn't happening, the sun was blazing. It was populated by wild jackasses that just ran around causing trouble, like jackass gangs or something. There was poisonous swamps in the south part. But some people decided to settle there. And they figured, well, we'll make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Pretty soon they discovered that with this mud, when you baked it, it became rock hard. You could even make nails out of it. They would make axes and hammers out of this baked mud. And they would build their cities. Unfortunately, when it rained, how stupid is this? They'd have to rebuild their cities. And I just can't imagine doing that. Like, just figure something else out. Import some rock. Because I can't imagine rebuilding my building every time it rained. So, but what turned out happening is that the Sumers, the rich mud, it yielded crops beyond anything anyone had ever known. So they had massive surpluses of food, so they began trading for the things they lacked. They traded with other areas, their food, and they got lumber and whatever, anything they didn't have there, metal, and pretty soon they thrived. They started building cities. This is kind of interesting here. It says all of a sudden around 3300 BC, all of these immigrants flooded in. All these from various regions. Nobody really knows why. They don't know if they were there as conquerors or just as farmers and merchants. But the record shows that all of a sudden there's lots of immigrants. And the rich guys there, the temples, basically they controlled the economy. The priests. They employed all these immigrants to build skyscraping monuments, Towers of Babel, if you will. And it's interesting, though, because, it's almost a chicken and the egg situation. In the Bible, it says when man built the Tower of Babel, all of a sudden, everyone started speaking different languages. But really, the reality was people who were speaking different languages had already moved in, and now these towers were rising due to their, this cheaper labor. So we have a thing about the cities of Sumer. Pretty soon there's a lot of cities all up and down this fertile crescent. Talk about the development of language. There was so much business, they needed to tabulate it. And so they basically had to discover writing, develop writing, just to keep track of all the transactions. This shows Larry Gonick's rarely laugh out loud funny, but he's just a clever guy. So they talk about at one point, for some reason, all the script in Sumer just flipped on its side. And that's because the tablets, the way they were writing, they realized, oh, we won't smear the letters as much. But so this guy says, look, it's a revolution in handwriting. And this guy says, a quarter revolution, you mean? And I know you're probably not slapping your knee right now, but almost every panel has something that's kind of clever. You know, Larry Connick's a witty guy. So the civilization's booming. And of course, that means a striation of society. I remember in college when I took early anthropology courses or anthropology courses about early civilizations, they almost judge a civilization by the stratification of society. So the fact that there's a few rich people and a lot of poor people, that's almost like a signpost of, look, they're getting civilized. As opposed to, nomadic cultures, who pretty much everyone was kind of equal for the most part. So this is interesting. The high priest of each city, they were elected. They didn't really get the concept of monarchy until one day, one guy just said, I don't want to step down. I should be the ruler for life. And he had enough soldiers to make everyone say, oh, okay. So he, when he died, his son took over. So basically monarchy begins. It's interesting. They talk about Gilgamesh as if he was a real guy. Maybe he was. I never do this. There's the Epic of Gilgamesh, a famous piece of writing. But it was based on a real guy. He didn't really fight monsters and stuff. But he did apparently, according to Larry Connick, have a wild man friend named Enkidu. And, basically he was just a shitty asshole king. But, of course, he wrote his own legend. He, propagandized himself. And so that's where the Epic of Gilgamesh comes from. So basically around this time, the city-states start fighting each other. And we just get an account of a bunch of cities attacking other cities, various conflicts. Here's a nice little aside here about how they would read the future from the shape and color of a sheep's liver. And he posits that, around the same time astrology was created, he says, for some reason, astrology survived while liverology perished long ago. It might have been otherwise, though. We see a modern couple. What's your liver scope say today? Don't lose sleep over jaundiced sheep. So here's where we're just seeing more conflicts. We see this one king, he just taxed the shit out of his people. Everything you did was taxed. If you divorce your wife, you'd have to pay 5 shekels or whatever. And this one king got rid of that guy and abolished all the taxes. And he's the first tax reformer in history. It's another thing of civilization, it seems, happens. Misogyny. Like all of a sudden men I guess want to control their wives more. And there's laws that said if a woman even contradicts her husband, he has the right to bash her teeth in with bricks, which usually was just for a woman who had more than one husband. But then it just became let's totally keep these women down. We don't want to hear their lip. Next we see Sargon. Sargon was of the Semite tribes out of Canaan, and he takes over Sumer. And for a few generations he does. But then the Sumerians take back over. And then we have the Martu come in. The empire gets even bigger. The Martu were kind of more barbaric. But it's interesting as the Martu settled down. I mean, they totally conquered. The Elamites totally conquered Sumeria. And then they just kind of left. So all that was left was the Martu. We're just kind of, and they kind of assimilated all of the Sumerian ideals, their religion, everything. Even though they kind of helped conquer them, they were also just like, yeah, these guys had a lot of good ideas. I guess kind of like the Romans with the Greeks, you know. So this is when Babylon arises, and this is Hammurabi, famous for his code of laws. But he introduced the idea of, putting his own god, Marduk, over all the others. We'll see this in Egypt constantly, where pharaohs and kings in other parts of the world, to seal their power, in this theology where there's many gods, they'll be like, oh, my god's top dog. Here's another interesting aside about how this is around this time men started forcing their women to wear veils, their wives, and which probably wasn't fun. And ironically, slaves and concubines didn't have to wear veils. So it's just like, okay, you're being punished for getting married. I would have been a concubine back then, and I would have been a damn good one. Next, we were introduced to Abraham. Here's a little foreshadowing of the next chapter 4. Abraham basically begins the tribe of Israel. He hears a word from God. The word of God, it says, make a great nation. And they basically leave to Canaan. And they talk about how all of these, they came from Sumer. That's why the Bible has so many stories about Babylon, and, they remembered their shared history. This is interesting, too, just like that Gilgamesh story. So, Larry Gonick, definitely just trying to chronicle real history as well as he can. But he tells the story about Abraham and his son Isaac. The famous story from the Bible where God says, Abraham, prove your love for me, sacrifice your son. And Abraham's going to do it. But then at the last minute, in the Bible, God says, oh, just kidding. You let him go. In this one, they make it just seem like he was a rebellious youth and his father wanted to teach him a lesson. So, I guess, I don't know if there's historical proof of a guy named Abraham and a son named Isaac and all this. But now we're going to cut away to the second half of this book. Now we're going to focus on Egypt. So here's a nice little map of Egypt to give us the lay of the land. So around 3000 BC, there were civilizations in Egypt since 7000. But around 2000 BC, the upper and lower parts of Egypt united under a king, King Menes, and the dynastic age began. And this is when Egyptian culture flourishes. I guess Egypt was just so fertile, and like the Nile would just gently flood and leave this wonderful silt everywhere. Nobody had to work that hard. Food was pretty much, so they had time for luxury and leisure. And that's probably why their civilization prospered. Talks about how they didn't use clay tablets to write on, they used papyrus, paper. And they had all these developments, It's interesting, in the pre-dynastic days, kings were put to death when they grew too feeble. Like, they didn't just let them retire. It was just like, no, we got to kill you. And they killed all of their servants just to ease the transition. They changed that once one king got it in his head to hire enough soldiers when he was old and feeble to just be like, no, you're not going to kill me. And that's not going to happen. So we see in both of these cultures just how power keeps moving upward. Egypt becomes obscene. This is an interesting little aside here, talking about the making of mummies. Ordinarily, mummification was begun as soon as they could after the person died. It was, I imagine, just easier. But if it was a noble woman, they would let her rot for a few days to thwart a possible necrophiliac embalmer. That's so weird that they're actually like, yeah, there's a good chance this embalmer's gonna fuck our daughter who died. So let's let her get all stanky and nasty. So even he won't want to do it. Very odd. So this is when the pyramids start. And this was, basically we would call this an overreach of power now, where the pharaohs just became so full of themselves. They were like, basically, they thought they were gods. And they didn't give a shit about anyone in Egypt. So the slow time of the planting season, during the flooding season when you couldn't really farm, all these peasants finally got a little break, a little time of the year. But no, now he basically forced them into labor on these pyramids. And in fact, the Egyptian word for taxation actually means labor. It doesn't mean money. These pharaohs would tax the locals by impounding them into service. Just so shitty. These people were so bad. So this goes on. Basically, Egypt was pretty chill. Everything fell into just this centuries-long rhythm where everyone knew their place and just kept moving along smoothly until the Hyksos invade. Hyksos came from the Caucasus Mountains, just like the Aryans who conquered India. They were the first people to breed horses, and the fact that they had horse-driven chariots gave them a huge military advantage. They come down to Egypt, and Egypt basically just capitulates almost immediately. They barely put up a fight. Not only are the Hyksos more militarily advanced due to their chariots, but just the Egyptians are freaked out by the horses. They're actually like, what are these things? They're too scared to fight back almost. So now these Hyksos, they're known as the foreign kings. Of course, all the Egyptians hated this. As one guy says, white people ruling black people? It's unheard of. It can't last. Kind of a sad little commentary. But eventually the Egyptians learned to love horses and learned how to use them and make chariots. So this one baron of Thebes, he attacked the Hyksos and drove them out of Egypt. And he killed all of his rivals and became the pharaoh of all of Egypt. And now Egypt is truly an empire. Which leads us into the next chapter, Nasty Dynasty. It's kind of like an off rhyme. Doesn't quite. Nasty Dynasty. And we see these various pharaohs consolidating power, basically becoming worse and worse. There was a woman pharaoh once. This one woman here. It's kind of amazing. They say that she put a fake beard on, but I think everyone knew she was a woman. It was just a little sop to them to be like, okay, I'll pretend to be a guy, kinda. She apparently was a pretty good pharaoh. 20 years of peace. She devoted herself to commerce and doing good stuff. When she died, though, her nephew takes over, and he's a total dick. And he's Thutmose. And Larry Ghana claims he's the nastiest of a nasty dynasty. I thought this was interesting. The Hyksos, when they attacked one city, Kadesh, the king of Kadesh thought he had a foolproof plan to screw up the chariots. Where he had these bears in heat. He released them out into the field, hoping that the chariot horses we just run off trying to chase these mares. But I think that after that, they just started using geldings. So now we're up to 1500 BC. This is kind of nice. He gives us a nice overview of the ancient world. We see Crete, the Achaeans, the Greeks, the Hittites. What's going on? Definitely helpful. And also during this time, the development of bronze begins, which will change a lot of things. And now we get into Tutankhamun. So there's this new pharaoh, and just like what we saw in Sumer, this pharaoh, whose name was Amenhotep IV, one day just said, there's only one God. Forget all those other gods in our pantheon. There's only one. And not only that, he made up the god. It's Aton, which is the disk of the sun. Not the sun itself, just the abstract disk. So, Egyptians were used to worshiping hippopotamus gods and gods that look like dogs and cats, kind of anthropomorphic gods. And he's just like, oh no, God is this weird abstract concept. He tore down all the other temples. And of course, a lot of people did not like this. This was just kind of crazy. He changed his name to Akhenaten, which means something like useful to Aton. And he's incredibly hated. And his queen is Nefertiti, one of the few people I've heard of in here. It says that Akhenaten fell in love with his nephew, and so Nefertiti moved out. I never heard of that in my history classes. And so Nefertiti gave her daughter and the crown to a little boy, Tutankhamun. But the old school religious people saw this as an opportunity to get rid of all the statues of Akhenaten and reopen all the old temples. So it was relatively short-lived, this religion, And so now we get to Ramses the Great in like 1290 BC. And he really is an empire builder. But he's not, he basically named himself Ramses the Great. That's what they think. He wasn't that great. I mean, he tried to build an empire. That's what I meant to say. But it sounds like he was a pretty inept general. And Larry Gonick illustrates this whole campaign he did against, I believe, the Canaanites. Or people in Canaan. But he did end up winning against these people, technically, on the field of battle. Oh, I'm sorry, it was the Hittites in Canaan. But even though he technically beat them in this one huge battle, as soon as he left, the Hittites totally took over. So it's not like it was a total Pyrrhic victory. He didn't really, because he lost a lot of men in these battles. The army was decimated, and it didn't really stop the Hittites at all. And now there are condoms named after him. So now we're at 1200 BC. It seems like it's kind of a dark age for the Mediterranean world. Egypt becomes very insular after Ramses' death and weakens. 300 years later, did fall to foreign rule. The Mitanni, who had kind of settled Sumer, were attacked by the Assyrians, and the Hittites were weakened from fighting with Egypt. So it's not a good time in that time. So it is a nice two-page spread of Larry Gonick doing his best to draw straight. It's not the best, but it's kind of nice. And then we see, Canaan too is about to have its problems. An army of slaves had escaped from Egypt, and we see the Israelites. So that's the lead into next issue. Once again, we have a nice little book list, recommended reading, Get some more little funny little gags in here. And then we have the coming attraction for next issue, the Old Testament. So I'm looking forward to that. I love reading secular views of biblical times. I know most of the stories in the Bible, and but I like to know, they're all based on something. So I like to find out actually what happened as far as what we know, the historical record, if you will. Even though all that shit's lost to the mists of history, who knows if any of that's true. Okay, guys, thanks for watching today. Hope you enjoyed watching today's video, and I hope to see you next time here at the Herculespetix Academy of Comic Book Studies.